что, продолжим наш обзор творчества художников
Okay, let us continue our overview.
послевоенного российского искусства.
So we will continue our discussion of the post-war Soviet art.
из берегов и не успела
Unfortunately,
сказать
the last time
брата-близнеца
I got carried away
Кабакова, его друга,
and I didn't have
соратника,
time to talk about Ilya
не успела
Kabakov's
рассказать вам о творчестве Виктора
colleague.
Пивоварова
I
на
didn't have
фоне
enough time to talk about
как
Viktor
раз
Pivovarov.
работ самого Ильи Иосифовича и его размышлений о
I think this is
современности, о том,
important
каким
to
должно быть произведение
compare our
искусства
today's story with the
в Брежневской
background
Москве.
of Ilya Kabakov's
И
narratives
пришлось,
and
к моему
his
великому
thoughts
удовольствию, разделить
on
эти
the
истории на две
path of
полноценные
artist in the Brezhnev era.
биографические
Actually, it is my great
такие
pleasure to
лекции.
dedicate a whole
Итак,
talk
сегодня мы с
to
вами говорим
Pivovarov
про
too.
Виктора Пивоварова, который родился в
So,
1937
our today's
году.
hero
И,
is Viktor
то
Pivovarov,
есть он как
born
бы
in
помоложе, чем
1937. He is a bit
Кабаков, Булатов.
younger than Kabakov
Но
and Bulatov.
основная его основной период формирования творческого метода пришелся на те же
His
самые
artistic method
60-е
was
годы,
built and formed
разве что с
in the
некоторым
same period,
опозданием.
in the 60s,
Виктор
with a
Пивоваров
bit of a
окончил
lag.
полиграфический
Viktor
институт
Pivovarov
и,
graduated from the Polygraphic
ну, собственно
Institute.
говоря, изначально планировал
Initially,
хотел очень заниматься книжной иллюстрацией,
his plan
поэтому
was to do
полиграфический
illustrations
институт в
for
его
books.
биографии
This is
появился не
why the
случайно.
institute that he
Любопытно,
entered
что
was
в
no
это же
accident.
время рядом с ним учится Владимир Янкелевский, о котором мы
Curiously,
уже говорили
Vladimir
с вами.
Yankelevsky was
И
one of his
в связи с не
peers.
только разницей,
We have
что
discussed
Владимир
Yankelevsky's
Янкелевский
art already.
с
The
восхищением
difference is, though, that
относится к тогдашнему преподавателю
Yankelevsky admired
на курсе художников-иллюстраторов.
the professor at the illustration course,
относится к Элию Белютину, студию которого он
Ilya
посещает.
Bilutin.
Для
He
Виктора
attended his
Пивоварова с
workshop and he
его
was in awe. But for
абсолютно
Viktor Pivovarov,
камерным и
with his absolutely different take on
хрупким
illustration,
даром, школа
his
Белютина
talent is
показалась
different. It is fragile.
слишком тяжеловесной, его метод
For him,
слишком
that school
агрессивным, и
was too aggressive,
с
too heavy.
Янкелевским Пивоваров продолжил сердечную дружбу, а
Pivovarov
с
stayed friends
Белютиным
with
работать
Yankelevsky.
не смог.
However, he could
И
not
после нескольких
collaborate with
занятий в
Bilutin.
студии этого
And after a few classes
гиганта
at
конца
Bilutin's
50-х
workshop,
годов,
at the workshop of
в
this
своих
giant of the
воспоминаниях
50s,
написал, что
he
уход из
wrote in
студии
his
Белютина
memoirs that when he
напомнил
left
ему
Bilutin's
дисточный
workshop,
электроприбор. Он чувствовал себя абсолютно опустошенным
he
и как
reminded
будто
himself of a
вынужден
device which
был
is not
заново
connected to
искать опоры
electricity.
для
He
своего
was completely empty and he was
творческого
forced to
разбега.
look for
Уже в
new
1963
supports
году он начинает
for
сотрудничать с
his new
издательством
beginnings.
«Детская
In
литература».
1963, he starts to
И
collaborate with the
хотя это был невероятно
children literature
сложный
publishing house
для
Детская литература.
художника-иллюстратора маршрут, Виктору повезло,
The
и
trajectory was
главный
extremely
редактор этого
challenging
издательства
for
приняла
him, but he was
его
lucky.
не только
Editor-in-chief
как художника,
of the
но и
publishing
как
house accepted him
советчика,
not only as an
эксперта.
artist, but also
И
as a
с
counselor.
этого момента начинается его работа в
Since
области
then on,
книжного иллюстрирования.
his work started.
Тем более, что его женой становится
What is more,
молодая
he married
писательница, художница,
a young
поэтесса
artist,
Ирина Пивоварова,
poet, and
которая
writer
мечтает
Irina Pivovarova.
создавать книги вместе с своим
Her
молодым
dream
мужем.
was
И, наконец,
to
это
make books
случается
together
в
with her
1968
young
году.
husband,
Вместе
and
они
this dream
выпускают книгу
became
«По
reality in
учебному свет»,
1968. It was when they
которая
published
в значительной степени сохранила
their
свои
first book.
стилистические черты детской
It
книги
was called
60-х,
Spider and
но в
Moonlight.
которой уже
It
проявляются некоторые
carried
свойства,
on the
которые впоследствии
main
мы
traditions,
увидим
the
в
mainstream of
станковых
children
работах
books
Виктора Пивоварова,
illustrations
сделанных в
from the
кавычках
60s,
для
but it
себя.
also has
По понятным
some of their
причинам он, так же,
characteristics,
как
which
Илья
we will
Кабаков и прочие
later see
авторы
in
этого времени, жил
Pivovarov's
двойной
art.
жизнью.
Like Kabakov, he was
В
forced to live
книге
a double life.
«Воспоминания. Влюбленный агент» Пивоваров
In his
описывает
book of
свои
memoirs,
первые впечатления от
Agent
литературы, но
that
не
fell in
только.
love, he describes his first impressions about literature,
В
but not
детстве
only
он
that.
слушает по радио радиопостановку
When he was a child, he was
книги
listening to
Ханса Христиана
radio
Андерсена
broadcasts
«Оля
of
Лукоя».
Hans
И для
Christian
него
Andersen's books, namely
этот
Ole
текст, эта
Lukoia.
образность становится как бы
And these
ключевыми
images, this
на всю
text,
его
becomes key
следующую
for him
жизнь.
for
И
the
не
rest
только
of
в
his
том,
life.
что касается мира грез и
And it does not only
сновидений, чудесного
concern
мира
the realm of dreams,
волшебника, которым и является,
fairy
собственно говоря,
tales,
в
this
представлении
magical
Пивоварова
world
художник, как создатель
inhabited
своих
by
автономных
magicians,
миров.
and artists
Но
are
и с точки
exactly that for
зрения
Pivovarov, magicians that
скрытого
create their own
эротизма этого
autonomous worlds.
повествования,
But
которое
another feature that was
заставляет
important for
мир
him was the hidden
раскрываться в любви
eroticism of this
к
narrative that forces the world to open
человеку,
up
к тому, кто входит
in
в
reaction to
тайные,
the love of a
потайные
human, of a man
норки
that
этого
enters the mysterious
скрытого от человеческих глаз, особенно от
underground,
взрослых
hidden
глаз,
from the
мира. И
human
таким
eyes, especially
образом
from
уже,
the
можно сказать,
eyes
в
of adults.
юности складывается образ сказки Оли
Thus,
Лукоя,
already in
которую
his
ему
early
посчастливилось
years,
иллюстрировать уже в 1969 году.
Pivovarov was enchanted
И, как он
by this
писал,
by this
вспоминая
story, Ole
про
Lukoia,
эту
and he was
работу,
lucky
мне
to
удалось
do illustrations for the publication of this
поженить
book in
Андерсена с Боском.
1969.
Детские
He used to
иллюстрации,
write that he
которые
managed to marry Andersen and
книга,
Bosk.
представляют нам мир,
The
полный
illustrations
чудес,
in this book
невероятных
show us a
приключений,
world full of
и при
miracles,
этом
unbelievable adventures.
этот мир таит в себе
At the same
множество
time,
секретов. Эти
this
иллюстрации
world
можно
has a lot of
разглядывать
secrets,
часами.
and one
И,
can
собственно говоря, именно
look at these
поэтому,
illustrations for
скорее всего,
hours.
книга с
They're extremely
иллюстрациями
rich.
Виктора Пивоварова
Most
переживает
probably,
множество
this is the
переизданий.
reason why this
И в
book
советские
was
годы, и после
republished a few
распада
times.
СССР.
It had a lot of,
И
it saw a lot of editions
классические книги,
in the
которые
Soviet years and even later
проиллюстрировал
on.
Пивоваров. Любопытно для нас сегодня
Pivovarov illustrated a lot of
легкостью, с
classical
которой
books. And what
художник
I
меняет
think
стилевые
is
регистры.
most
Конечно, у него
striking
есть
in
некое
these
ядро,
illustrations is how easily
свой
Pivovarov
излюбленный стиль,
changes
достаточно
registers. Of
сравнить
course, he
Олю
has his
Лукоя
own style.
с
It is enough to compare Ole
оформлением книги
Lukoia's
«Черная
illustrations
курица»
with
Каржельского,
the
но
illustrations
в зависимости
to
от
the
текста, от
Black
времени его
Chicken.
создания, Пивоваров может
However,
работать с рокальными
in
мотивами,
different
может имитировать
decades
стиль
and
Эли
working with
Лисицкого и
different
русский
texts,
авангард,
Pivovarov
который,
can
конечно же, в
change
изобразительном искусстве
registers.
того времени
Somewhere he
невозможен, но зато в
imitates
детской книге
Lisitsky's style.
оказывается
Of course, in
возможно все.
mainstream
И,
literature at that
конечно,
time it was
«Красный шар»
impossible,
Генриха
but
Сапгира
in books
оформлен
for children,
абсолютно в
it
таком
somehow
вот супрематическом
becomes
духе,
possible. To the
в
right,
духе
you see
сказки о двух
Henrik Sapgir's
квадратах.
book
И
illustrated
уже
in
здесь, так же, как и в Оле Лукое, мы
a
видим
remarkably
приемы,
suprematist
которые
style.
Пивоваров будет
And
использовать
here,
в
like in
дальнейшем
Ole Lukoia's
в
illustrations, we can see
творчестве для
some of the
себя.
features that will be
Это
used in
творчество
Pivovarov's own art.
складывается очень непросто, и в течение нескольких
At
лет
first, he struggles with his
художник
creative
ищет
journey, and for many
возможности
decades,
начать работать
not for one,
в графике, в
Viktor
живописи,
Pivovarov
в
is
живописи
looking
ему
for
труднее
his own
всего.
style in painting,
И
in graphics.
вы
He struggles
удивитесь, но
most with
так
painting.
же, как Булатов и
And you'll be
Кабаков,
surprised, but just
своим
like Bulatov
источником
and
вдохновения
Kabakov,
Пивоваров называет
Pivovarov
те самые железнодорожные
was inspired
вагоны,
again with
железнодорожные плакаты,
railway
которые
posters.
предупреждают
The railway posters that warn
человека о
passers
близости
by
смерти если он не
about
будет
the closeness
следовать
of death
правилам.
unless they
Жековские
follow the
стенды,
rules.
железнодорожные плакаты, как такие символы советской
These
визуальности,
posters were actually
дают,
symbolic
несмотря на всю свою
for the
анонимную
Soviet
эстетику и
visual culture. Although the
внутреннюю
aesthetics
такую
is largely
содержательную
anonymous,
напряженность,
they have a
дают,
lot of
видимо,
tension.
художникам этого поколения
And I believe that these were these
направление
posters
движения, куда надо
that set the trajectory
двигаться
for
в
the
мире,
artists of
где
that
все
time,
начиная с
that
агитации
trajectory
идеологической до
about where to move in this
рекламы
world, where everything
абхазских
beginning with
мандаринов
propaganda and
выглядит
ending
как
with the
абсолютная плоскостность,
advertising of the
анонимная,
tangerines looks
холодная
very
и
flat, very anonymous, very cold.
предельно безликая. И у
It is
Булатова, и у
neutral
Кабакова,
and
и теперь у
faceless.
Пивоварова
This is the style
основная
of Soviet posters. And
линия
Kabakov and now
исследования
Pivovarov
от
continue this
фронтальности вглубь,
research. They
от
go from the surface
плоскостности и
into depth,
информативности плаката в
from informative
сложный мир
posters into
живописной
more complex
метафоры и
world of pictorial
слоистых
metaphors
миров, из
and
которых
layered
складывается
worlds,
субъективный мир
which come
человека.
together into the subjective
И,
world of a human
конечно же,
being.
так же, как в случае с Ильей
And pretty
Кабаковым,
much like in
работы
Kabakov's
Пивоварова
case,
не могли бы сложиться так, как они
Pivovarov's
сложились, без
works
влияния
could not happen.
работы в сфере
They could not be possible
детского
without his
книгоиздания.
background
Ведь этот
in
фантастический
illustrating
мир
children's
детского
books.
воображения
This fantastic world of fantasies and
неповторим,
imagination
неподцензурен, то, что невозможно
is not
взрослому,
subject
вполне
to censorship.
осуществимо в детской
Things that are
мечте.
not
Поэтому
allowed
Пивоваров
for
до конца
adults
своей
are completely okay as long as they remain
до настоящего
in
времени
the children's
сохраняет
fantasies.
и не только бодрость духа, но и
Viktor
такой детский
Pivovarov
восторг от мира, в
still,
котором он
even
может
now, manages to
побеждать,
retain this kind of
не обращая
childish awe and
внимания
excitement,
на сложности политической, социальной,
despite
экономической
all the challenges of the
сферы.
political,
И
social,
Пивоваров сказочник
economic life.
начинает свой маршрут. В середине
Pivovarov
60-х годов,
is a
когда
storyteller,
создает
is a
несколько
tale
работ,
teller, and he begins his
сделанных
creative journey
по принципу сюрреалистического
in the
коллажа.
60s.
И
These are the
что
works
интересно,
that
не
he
будучи
executed in
тогда
the
еще
style
знаком тесно с
of
Ильей
collage.
Кабаковым, Пивоваров
He did
использует
not
те же
know Ilya
приемы, что и
Kabakov
он,
yet well at that time, but he
чтобы
uses
уйти от
the same tools.
живописности как
He uses the
некой
same approaches
ценностной
because he
категории,
wants to
навязанной
avoid
в годами
figurability and academic
обучения
painting,
в
which was
советских
imposed on him
академических институтах.
through the
Он
decades of
использует
studying at
вместо
Soviet
холста
institutions.
строительный
Instead of
материал,
canvas,
орголит.
he uses
Вместо
orgolite
традиционного
again,
масла
and
использует
instead of oils,
нитроэмаль. Его
he
работы
uses animal.
глянцевые, почти монохромные на
His
больших
works are
площадях.
glossy, they are
Ну,
huge,
вот
they are
этот
almost monochromous.
красный на картине отражение, в принципе, не интонирован.
And
Но
the red you
основная
can
его
see in the
задача
painting
развернуть повествование в
is a
том,
monocolor,
где в тех
but
участках
his main objective is
листа
to
бумаги или
unfold
живописной
narrative
поверхности,
in
где
those
он может
spots of the pictorial
манипулировать
surface or of the paper
пространственными
where he
эффектами, и
can
поэтому,
manipulate
отражаясь друг в
our
друге,
perception of space.
миры то выступает
The worlds seem to be
на первый план,
reflected in
заслоняя
each other.
друг друга, то раскрываются в
Sometimes they
бесконечной
come to the
анфиладе
foreground, or sometimes they are revealed in an
и
enfilade
здесь
of
уже в этой ранней
horizons
работе появляются
that open up one after another. And even in
мотивы,
this very early
впоследствии
work, we can see some motives
повторяющиеся
that later
из
will
работы
be
в работу, из
reproduced
серии в
in
серию.
many of his works, in
Это и
many of his
силуэт
series.
рыбы
By this,
из
I mean
свеча,
a
надкушенное
silhouette of
яблоко,
a fish,
мужчина в темных
candle,
очках и в шляпе.
half of an apple,
Такой
a man wearing
привет еще одному вдохновителю
dark
московских
glasses and a
неофициальных
hat.
художников
This is
60-х
a
годов,
reference
Рене
to another
Магритте, естественно.
inspiration of the Soviet artist
это
René Magritte, of course.
неочевидность видимого мира, которая наслаивается
The visible world
на оптику
ceases
человека
being
как
obvious.
проницаемые слои
What
реальности,
we see
воображения,
are layers of reality and
делает
imagination.
работы
Some of them
Пивоварова
transparent, some of them are not.
больше похожими не столько
This
на
is what makes Pivovarov's
концептуализм в
art
его
closer
традиционном
not to
понимании, даже
conceptual
там
art in its
Бориса
traditional
Гройса, который
understanding, even in Boris
посвящает
Groys's
анализу
understanding,
московского романтического
who
концептуализма не один свой
analyzes
текст,
Moscow
сколько на
conceptual
сюрреализм как
school
некую
a lot.
художественную систему,
But here we can
которая,
see
не
a different
будучи пройдена в
artistic system.
искусстве России и Советского Союза в 20-30-е годы,
It is something that
послужила
the
благотворной
Soviet
почвой для
art did not go
перманентного
through in the
освоения
20s and in the 30s, but it became
так же,
fertile
как
ground
лирическая
for
абстракция,
rethinking,
сюрреализм в
for
искусстве
reowning.
60-х годов и
I
далее.
mean, surrealism.
Это, как
It
правило,
became inspiration for
то
Soviet
поле,
art in the 60s
где
and later on.
художник навсегда прощается с академическим прошлым,
It
открывает для
becomes the
себя
playground where
возможности
artists
мира
say farewell to their academic
чудесных
training.
превращений. Конечно же,
They
никто из
discover a whole
советских
new
живописцев,
world of magic
ориентировавшихся на
transformations. Of
репродукции
course,
в большей
none
степени, чем на
of
теорию, ничего не знал о
Moscow-based
сюрреалистической революции, но
artists know anything
если у
about the
многих
surrealist
апелляции к
revolutions.
сюрреализму Дали
What they had
была
access to were just
скорее
reproductions, copies.
результатом
If
достаточно
Dali's
профанных размышлений о
surrealism
смысле этого стиля модернизма,
was
то для многих сюрреализм оказался
understood through the
возможностью
lens
переломить стандарты
through the lens of trying to
постренессансного
reveal a
реалистического
new world.
изображения
For many,
и
however,
сформулировать свои
surrealism
принципы,
became a
используя
way of breaking through
многообразные вариации сюрреализма
post-Renaissance
Европы и
rules of
Америки
paintings.
как некий единый словарь,
Moscow-based artists
утративший
saw
свое
surrealism of the US and Europe
теоретическое
as
обоснование,
a kind of
то есть
vocabulary
словарь без
that
словарных
lost
статей.
its theoretical
И поэтому
foundations. It's a kind of a
Пивоваров смело
vocabulary, not a
использует
dictionary.
и прорывы пространств,
This is
и
why
отдельные
Pivovarov
элементы
breaks through the space, the
фигуративных
surface,
изображений,
and uses certain elements,
коллажность
figurative
и, конечно
elements.
же, текст в своих картинах он
He
тоже
uses the methods of
использует.
collage in his
При
paintings,
этом
and of course he
в
uses a lot of text.
работах Пивоварова, в отличие от работ, например, Ильи Кабакова,
Unlike
нет
Ilya Kabakov's art,
очень жестких прорывных
in
решений.
Victor
Есть
Pivovarov's works,
последовательное
there are no harsh
освоение
solutions.
технологии,
He never makes a
стилистики
U-turn.
и
It's
попытка
always a
объединить
progressive mastering
находки
of a certain
западных
style.
мастеров
He tries to
со своим
embrace
опытом детского
different
иллюстрирования
discoveries
и
of Western artists
внутренними
and merge it with his experience as an illustrator of
переживаниями,
books for
связанными
children.
с его
He adds up to the mixture his own
жизнью в этой
experience,
стране, в этом
his own
месте,
life,
в это
his
время.
background as an artist who was born in that
Как
country at
видите,
that time.
на ранних работах переходного
As you can see,
периода
in early
мы
works
видим, опять же, горящие
of his
свечи,
transition
и
period, we can
фигуры
see
мужчин
burning
в котелке и в
candles,
темных очках,
we can still see
силуэтные
male figures
вот эти
in
пространственные
hats and
вылеты
dark glasses,
на
breakthroughs
фигуре
below the
женщины
surface
здесь
into different
и, собственно,
spaces.
здесь.
We can see
И
male
нарушение гравитационных
figures, both here and in the previous
правил,
one.
которые реалистическая картина накладывает
Another
на
thing
художника.
that
И
is
в мире
noticeable
Пивоварова
is that the
можно
rules of
не только
gravity
летать
do not
как
apply
чудесным
here.
образом, как это было в альбомах Кабакова.
In
Можно было
Pivovarov's
ходить
works, one
вверх,
cannot just fly as in
гулять
Kabakov's
по
albums.
спинке
One
венского
can
стула
walk
и творить невероятные чудеса.
on the
На
back
рубеже
of the chair.
60-70-х
One
годов
can make
Пивоваров
miracles.
наконец знакомится более тесно с основными
At the end
представителями
of the
московского
70s,
андеграунда.
Victor Pivovarov
Именно
finally gets to know
Пивоваров,
the Moscow
преисполненный
underground
любви и
scene.
нежности к этому кругу друзей,
And Victor
создает в
Pivovarov,
96
who is in love
году
with the circle of friends,
лист
in
из альбома «Действующие
1996
лица». изображающий
creates
коллективное
this
тело
page from his
московского
album
неофициального искусства
titled The List of
60-х,
Characters.
70-х годов,
It's called The
где
Body of the Moscow
Кабаков
Unofficial Art
это
of the
мозг
60s and
коллективного
70s.
тела
Kabakov
Булатов,
here is featured
как
as
мощное
the
плечо
brain of this
держит
collective body.
шею.
Bulatov is the strong shoulder.
Rabin как социальная сила
Rabin
также
is the kind of a social force.
присутствует в мускулах руки. Сам же
It's
Пивоваров
also present here
изображает
in the
себя
arm muscles,
скромно где-то
the
под
shoulder
сердцем, даже
muscles.
не на сердце. На сердце,
Pivovarov
естественно, обитает
signs his name
Владимир
below the
Яковлев.
heart. Vladimir
Но
Yakovlev
легкие, околосердечная сфера,
inhabits the solar
выбранная
plexus.
самим автором для себя, как участник этого коллективного тела,
Pivovarov,
очень о многом
as a
говорит.
participant of this collective
И
body,
в
chooses
его
the
работах, как
space
я уже
around the
сказала,
heart for
меньше
himself.
холодности
And I
и
think this is very
аналитики,
meaningful. He has
меньше
less
социального
analysis
протеста
in his works.
и
His works are less
анекдота
cold. They are less about
соцартовского
social
типа.
protest.
Его
It's not an
работы
anecdote of the
преисполнены,
type of sots
безусловно,
art.
прежде всего любовью
His
ко
works are full
всему,
of
что его
love.
окружает, к
They are full of
любимым
love towards
мыслям
everything that
и
surrounds him.
стихам, видам природы и так
He
далее.
is in love with
Так
poetry,
же, как
with his
прочие,
surroundings, with
Виктор
landscapes,
Пивоваров
with everything.
часто приходит из своей
Viktor
мастерской на
Pivovarov very
Новороссийке
often
в гости к Илье Кабакову
comes
на
to visit
Сретенский
Ilya
бульвар.
Kabakov in his
Там он
workshop on the
слушает
Sretensky
разговоры об
Boulevard.
искусстве,
This is
высоколобые
where he
рассуждения о
listens to
духовной
conversations
миссии
about art, about the
альтернативного
spiritual
искусства,
mission of
агитки Оскара
alternative art.
Рабина, ратующего за
He
свободу
listens to
творчества,
Oscar Rabin,
и с,
who
как я уже сказала,
campaigns for the
удивительным
freedom
вниманием и
of
чуткостью.
creativity. And
Пивоваров
as I
спустя
said
много
before,
лет
he is amazingly sensitive.
тщательно
Many
изображает
years
то,
later,
что навсегда
Viktor
запечатлелось в его
Pivovarov
памяти.
meticulously
Свою жизнь в
portrays
этой
what he
мастерской,
remembered over those years, his life
которая
in this
находилась в
workshop.
полуподвале, он вспоминает с невероятной нежностью, несмотря на то, что там было сыро,
It is
темно
with great
и
love
холодно.
that he remembers those years,
Он
although
всегда,
the workshop was damp
рисуя,
and cold.
сидя за столом у окна, мог разговаривать со случайно зашедшими
He was
в
working
гости
at the
друзьями,
window,
проходившими мимо. Это,
and
кстати, лист из того же
his
альбома
friends that
«Действующие
went
лица»,
by
и
could always
в буквальном
come and
смысле
visit,
он
and they talked.
изображает
This is, by the
сцену,
way,
которая
a sheet
могла
from the same
случиться
album,
в
The List of
1973
Characters,
году
and it
в
shows
летней
another
Москве.
scene
И действительно к
that could
нему,
have
так же как
happened
к Кабакову,
in
приходили
the summer in
гости,
Moscow,
бурлила
somewhere in the 70s.
веселая богемная
Just like
жизнь,
Kabakov, Pivovarov was
в
visited
которой
by his
находилось
friends.
место и для
It
личной
was
жизни, и для
bohemian
творчества,
life,
и
full
для
of fun,
работы.
full of art, full of
Но
romance.
главное было вот это переживание,
However,
несмотря ни на что,
the main thing
феерического богатства форм этой жизни, всеобщее
was
веселье
him
и
experiencing the
беззаботности,
multitude of this
которые вполне
life, which was
отразились
full of fun,
в работе
which was
«Московская
careless.
вечеринка»,
It is something that
где
is very visible in this work titled
альтер-эго
A Moscow Party. Here you can
художника, по
see
всей видимости,
the
в той
artist's
самой
alter ego.
мастерской, открытой
Most
на
likely,
Московскую
he is in the same
улицу,
workshop.
летает над накрытым к застолью столом.
He is
При
flying over
этом здесь же
a late
находится
table.
и тот самый венский стул, по спинке которого можно
You can
гулять.
see here the same
Здесь же
chair,
красный,
on the back of which one can walk.
красно-кирпичный Кремль
As we
расположился
remember,
на табурете, а магритовский человек
on the stool to the
читает под
right,
столом
one can see
газету,
the Kremlin.
как будто исказив,
The Magritian
превратив интерьер
man is under the
волшебным
table
образом
reading
в
a
пейзаж,
newspaper.
так же
That's
как
the
тело
interior is turned
летящего
into a
мужчины
landscape,
в линию горизонта.
pretty much like the body of
Кстати,
the
под
flying
мышкой
man
этого
is
человека
turned
разливается
into
море, и в нем
the
плывет
landscape,
корабль.
into the horizon. In the armpit,
Сравните
one can
это
see
мысленно с
the
теми работами,
ocean
с которыми
and the ship
мы уже
in
познакомились.
it.
Я имею в виду те
You
работы
can
Янкелевского и
now
Кабакова,
compare
где мы
these
видим
works with
прорывы
Yankelevsky's and
пространственного
Kabakov's art,
монолита,
where we
где
saw
сквозь
breakthroughs
стену шкафа светит потусторонний
through
свет,
monolithic
где
space,
целостность мира
different
просвечивает
colors,
сквозь
different realities shining through, emanating through the surface of the painting.
фрагментированная реальность в альбомах Кабакова.
We saw all of that in Kabakov's albums. Here, Pivovarov turns to similar motives. In any circumstances, in his quiet workshop or at a noisy party, there is always a weak spot, kind of a transparent point, a spot in the space through which one can fly out straight into the world of fantasies, where the artist is a complete master of reality. And surprisingly, these thoughts did not produce anxiety. It's not about that. One of younger Moscow-based artists used to write about Moscow winter as eternal and hostile. However, Pivovarov takes a completely different approach, finds a completely different perspective on seeing this world as a thin film, and this gives hope that this time will be over sometime, and if it is not over, there are always other realms where one can hide, caves, hiding places, coverts, burrows. This motive later on was borrowed by Vera Khlebnikova and Maria Konstantinova, the younger generation of the artists. They were active in the 70s and in the 80s. And of course, these images later on were passed on to the son of Viktor Pivovarov, Pavel Pepperstein. Pavel worked a lot with these motives as well as with the motive of infantile fantasy that can make happen the revolution that André Breton wrote about. I don't think that Viktor Pivovarov was familiar with Breton's texts, not in the 70s anyway. Victor kept on experimenting with graphics and with painting. Gradually, he came to an idea of an album as a possible format. And as I promised you the last time, I'm not going to discuss who was first, Kabakov or Pivovarov, who first came up with the idea of an album as a format. Just like I don't want to discuss who was the first to use the image of a cupboard in their art or who made the first installation. I don't think it matters. Either simultaneously or borrowing it from each other, both Kabakov and Pivovarov come up with the format of an album as a kind of a visual framework for a complex work. But it's not a series of works. It's an album that one has to live through. When you look through an album, you stay in your private space. You're in indirect communication with the author. It's not a show, it's not an exhibition. It is supposed that you look through the leaves, that you look through the pages, and you can discuss what you see with others. Pivovarov's albums have nothing to do with the Soviet everyday life, with the Soviet facilities, have nothing to do with sociopathic tendencies of different characters that the album 10 characters is dedicated to. Viktor Pivovarov's albums are dedicated to two narratives, to two topics. The first being immersion into one's private memories, not to look through the beads of the beautiful past again, but to reassemble oneself and to remember oneself
идентичности, поиски этой идентичности.
as a whole
И
identity, as a
второй
single
момент, который
identity.
также
So it's
очень
about looking
важен,
for one's
это
identity. And the second narrative,
момент
which is
переноса
no least
обобщенных
important,
каких-то генерализированных
is
повествований
about
в зону
generalized
очень личных
narratives
дневниковых
and transitioning
записей.
them
Так,
into
в одном из ранних
very
альбомов
private,
«Лицо»
very personal
персонаж,
matters.
распадающийся
For example, in one of his
в глазах
early albums,
смотрящего,
the
его
face,
образ не складывается,
pages from which
хотя
we can see on
он
the
задает
screen,
вопрос:
we can
«Лицо,
see a
мое лицо ты
person
помнишь?»
with his
И
face being
зритель,
scattered into
не
pieces, and
вспомнив,
the text
пересобирает это
accompanying it
лицо
says,
с
and my
ошибкой,
face, do you
так
remember
что
my
узнать
face?
человека
And then the face is
невозможно.
reassembled, but with a lot of
Эм,
mistakes, making it impossible to
И
recognize this person. And
другие
the
листы этого же
second
альбома
text says, no, you don't.
показывают,
You don't
что
remember my face.
идентичности складываются
Other
не из
pages from this
воспоминаний
album
других,
show that
а из
their
своих
identities are
собственных
formed not by
воспоминаний
memories
о
of others,
вечере,
but by our
о
own
зеленой
memories
скамье в тени
about
кустов,
evenings, about
а другой
the bushes.
гранью твоей идентичности является двор из детства, голубятня, синее
And
небо
other
над
parts of
нами
your
в облаках.
identity
И
may
все
be the
это и есть
courtyard from your
человеческое
childhood
сознание, а вовсе
and
не
the blue sky
оппозиционность, ненависть к советской власти
with
или
clouds in it. So this is our
сложными
identity, and
философскими
not being
вопросами.
opposed
Мир
to
Пивоварова
the Soviet
одновременно и
reality
просто
and not some
сложен,
philosophical
потому что в
matters.
нем
Pivovar's world is very
складывается
simple and
и
complex at the same time.
увлеченность человеческой многовековой культурой и интерес
It
к
is enriched
модернистским системам
by the history of art,
взаимодействия
by
с
the history of human
современностью, и, конечно
culture.
же,
It interacts
бесконечный
with
рассказ, который он
contemporaneity.
пишет о себе,
And
о своих современниках,
of course,
очень
what is important
такой
here is the eternal
лиричный,
narrative
очень
that Pivovarov
трогательный
keeps writing
рассказ,
about himself and
в
his
котором
peers.
Пивоваров
This is
как
a
будто
very
бы все время
lyrical, very
является
touching story,
наблюдателем.
where Pivovarov
И
seems
в
to be an observer.
в тех же мемуарах в «Влюбленном агенте» Пивоваров пишет
And
о
in
том,
his
как он
memoirs,
рос в детстве
Pivovarov
почти все время один, шел в
also
школу,
writes about
возвращался
him
в
being alone
коммунальную
in his
комнату,
childhood.
сидел
He
за
went to
столом, делал
school, then he
уроки,
returned to his communal
созерцал
apartment.
темные
He
углы этой
did
маленькой
his homework
комнаты,
sitting at the
вспоминал,
table.
они
He
жили с
looked into the
мамой.
dark corners
И
of the room, which he
он
shared with
говорит
his
о том,
mother.
что это был мой образ жизни. Я был абсолютно
He
один, и
said
с тех
that it
пор
was
я,
his lifestyle. He was
несмотря на
completely
то, что у меня
alone.
были
And ever
друзья,
since then, although
любимые
he started to
женщины,
have
много
friends, lovers,
приключений, я так и остался одинок. И весь мир Пивоварова, он действительно как будто фокусируется на этом состоянии.
the whole world of
В конце
Pivovarov
концов, в том же
is
75 году
focused around the
Пивоваров
state of
создает
loneliness.
другой
In the
альбом
same year of
под
1975,
названием «Проект
Pivovarov
биографии
creates
одинокого
another
человека»
album titled
или
Projects
«Проекты
for
для
a
одинокого
Lonely
человека»,
Person.
где во введении, написанном аккуратным почерком
in the introduction,
художника-книжника, перечисляются
written
типы
in his
одиночества.
very beautiful
Первое — это
handwriting,
трагическое или
he goes through
экзистенциальное
different
одиночество.
types of
Второе —
loneliness. The
меланхолическое,
first one is
космическое
tragic,
одиночество. Третье — созерцательное
existential.
или
The second one,
метафизическое
cosmic.
одиночество. И,
The
наконец,
third one
радостное, абсолютное
is
одиночество
loneliness
с
of
приятием своего
observation,
состояния и
metaphysical. And the fourth one
тщательным,
is happy loneliness,
любовным
solitude.
взглядом на этот свой одинокий мир,
Happy or absolute
где ты
solitude,
проходишь все
with
по порядку стадии детства,
one's
после рождения ты идешь
acceptance
в
of
ясли,
one's own
потом ты в сад,
life.
в школу,
And
потом ты учишься в
this state
институте,
can be carried
потом
through
ты
all life stages. For
влюбляешься,
example,
вступаешь в брак,
going to the
разводишься,
kindergarten,
продолжаешь
school,
работать и так
marrying,
далее.
divorcing,
Примерно один и тот же паттерн в судьбе любого человека можно
studying, and so on and so forth.
расписать как проект биографии
It's the
одинокого
pattern
человека,
that
у которого,
all lonely
конечно же,
people
есть и
share.
свое жилье,
It can be
и
qualified as
предметы повседневного обихода, которые
a
Виктор Пивоваров
project
тщательно
of life
прописывает,
for lonely
буквально
people.
каталогизирует, и в этом
Viktor
смысле
Pivovarov
совпадает по механике создания среды на
creates
листе
almost a
бумаги
catalog
с
for all of
некоторыми
these types
работами
of
Ильи
loneliness.
Кабакова, который тоже тяготеет к
It rhymes
таблицам.
with
Вспомните
some
ответы
of
экспериментальной
Kabakov's works.
группы
Please remember his
и
answers
разные
for an experimental
прочие
group, where he uses worksheets
табличные
as
формы,
the organizing framework.
где самое важное в жизни
Here in
оказывается
Pivavarov's
каталогизировать
art, we
окружающий
can
мир,
see a similar take,
перечислить,
where the
поименовать
most
все, что
important
нас
endeavor is
окружает, все, с чем мы имеем дело. И в этом
systematizing what one
перечне
sees
будет
around
и
oneself,
яблоко, и
classifying it,
стул, и любимое
compiling a
лицо,
catalog,
и
an apple,
нелюбимое
a
лицо, и дорога
chair,
на работу и
a face I
обратно.
love, a face I hate,
Но
going to work,
маршруты, по
returning
которым мы
from work,
ходим,
routes that we
требуют
take.
внимания, описания во всех своих деталях.
Anything we do
И
requires
неудивительно,
meticulous
кстати, что именно в этот
documentation.
момент молодой концептуалист, поэт
It's no surprise that at
Лев
that time,
Рубинштейн
Lev
начинает работать с
Rubinstein, a young
картотечными
conceptual poet, starts working
библиотечными
with
карточками, на которых пишет
library
свои
cards.
стихи,
He
которые в
writes his
буквальном
poems
смысле
on them.
каталогизируют повседневную речь,
This is
превращая
literally a catalog
повседневность в
of everyday
поэтическое
speech. Thus, he turns
произведение, то
everyday
есть
life
создают из
into poetry.
профанного материала
He turns the
абсолютно
profane material
классические на сегодняшний уже день
into
лирические
classical,
стихотворения.
lyrical poems.
И для Виктора Пивоварова этот
For
каталог
Viktor
это
Pivovarov,
знаковая единица
this
текста и
catalog
изображения.
is very
Так же
important
актуально, как и для
as a
Рубинштейна,
framework,
Кабакова
and
и некоторых
it
других
is just
участников
as
процесса.
relevant as for
Что
Rubinstein, as for
касается
Kabakov and other artists.
разного рода повторений и,
As
ну,
for
скажем так,
different kinds of
накладок, где один мотив
repetitions
повторяется в
or
творчестве разных
overlaps,
художников,
where we see one and the same
то
motive
я думаю,
reproduced
что в этом
in
нет
the art of
никакого
different artists,
вопроса или каких-то коллизий,
I
таких
don't think that it has to be
усложняющих
seen
отношений между художниками.
from the perspective of
Конечно, они
borrowing
все
or
варились в одном котле.
something like this.
Среда
We
эта
shouldn't
была невероятно
we shouldn't
маленькой.
make the
И
relationships
так же, как
problematic in
шкаф,
our
образ
analysis.
шкафа, образ
Of course,
затесненного мрачного
they stayed in
пространства
one and the
для
same
художников,
small art scene.
мультипликаторов этого круга был ключевым,
They shared their
возможно,
ideas,
образом. То
and
«Человек
like
без
the
лица»
image
с
of
картины Рене Магрита «Сын человеческий».
an image of a
Еще
wardrobe or of
один
a
образ,
cupboard
который невероятно
was very
удачно
important
совпадал с
for some of the artists of that time. Just like that, a
представлениями
catalog was the framework
московских советских художников
which was relevant for others.
о современной человеческой идентичности, в
The catalog
которой
somehow rhymed with the
предмет
contemporary identity, with the
зачастую
contemporary Soviet
заслоняет
identity,
личность,
where
и
an
именно
object
предмет
is in the
становится
foreground and the human being is in the
своего рода
background. And objects
вторичным обликом
become secondary images.
героя, и люди без лица попадаются и в альбомах
We can see
Пивоварова,
faceless
в том же
characters in
альбоме «Лицо»,
Pivovarov's
или в
albums,
рисунках Ильи Кабакова,
in
серия
Kabakov's
«Головы».
drawings, in his heads.
Еще раз обращу
Yes.
внимание на пристрастие художников к разнообразным каталожным спискам, перечислениям, чертежам, своего рода
One
энциклопедии
cannot
универсума.
overestimate the importance of this
На одной из своих
structuring
работ
approach
Пивоваров
using
перечисляет,
catalogs,
что он
cards.
может изобразить.
In one of his works, Ilya
Он
Kabakov
может
goes through
изобразить и
everything that
яблоко,
he
и
can
диван, и дерево, и шкаф,
represent:
опять шкаф,
an apple,
и кошку, и стул, и вид в
a
окно.
cat,
Но как
a
изобразить жизнь
chair,
души, пишет он
a
внизу.
view,
Действительно, жизнь души в Московской концептуальной
anything,
школе
a
была
closet, again, a
практически
closet.
запретной темой,
And he
выведенной как бы
writes
за
at the
скобки.
bottom, but how do I represent the life of a
И
soul? And indeed, the life of a
жизнь
soul was
души,
something
конечно же,
bracketed out.
рассматривалась как скорее повод для философской спекуляции или как бы
The spiritual life or
рассматривалась
the
как
life of
тема,
one's
требующая
soul was
изощренной
considered to be a
метафоризации.
topic that
Но
needed
для
sophisticated
Пивоварова это
metaphors.
актуальный
But
вопрос,
for
который
Pivovarov,
касается
this
и
is
мира как
an extremely
такового,
relevant
где его
matter
душа,
because
и его собственного мира, которым
it
он
concerns
не
his
всегда
own
равен
world
себе. И
and the
это
world inhabited by his soul.
борьба за собственные границы, за
It is about him
идентичность и
fighting for his
собранность
own
вот во
boundaries, for his
внутреннем мире для
identity,
внешнего
for
присутствует в
him
целом ряде
reassembling his identity in the inner world
альбомов
for the outer world.
середины 70-х, особенно в альбоме
It is present in
«Конклюзии»,
different
где
albums,
он
including the
бесконечно
album titled
вопрошает
Conclusions, where he endlessly
на фоне
posits the
вопросов,
question.
утверждений туда-сюда, вверх-вниз и так далее.
Here,
Он все время в промежутках между этими константами
in
ищет,
between the
где, собственно,
constants
его
that he
место.
uses,
На полях «я»,
he
на
is
линии
always asking the
горизонта «не
question,
я».
where
Не
am
в тех
I?
же ли
For example,
образах
the boundary is
рассуждает
I,
о
and the
своей
middle is
идентичности
not I.
Пивоваров, глядя на
I think
работы
it
друзей
reminds one
Ильи Кабакова с его
of
любовью к
how Pivovarov
маргиналиям
sees
и
his friends and how
с
he
горизонтом
portrays the Moscow art
Эрика
scene.
Булатова.
And it can also remind
И
us
снова
of the horizon
повторяется
by
этот
Eric
вопрос,
Bulatov.
где я,
Here again,
не только в альбоме
Pivovarov
«Конклюзии», но
repeats the
и
question,
в
where am
альбоме
I?
«Сад», и в
And it's
альбоме
not
«Где я».
only true for the album
И вот
Conclusions,
этот
but
рефреном
also for
повторяемый
the
вопрос
album
о своем
Garden
месте, о том,
and for
где
the
же,
I
собственно
album.
говоря,
He keeps repeating
находится
this question. He
человек
keeps looking
внутри
for
тела,
the space
снаружи, за
occupied by a human
пределами
being. Where is the human being?
кожи
Inside of the
или в
body,
сердце, или в голове. Весь спектр
beyond
этих
the skin,
вопросов можно
in the
было бы
heart, or in the mind.
набросить на
This whole spectrum of
многочисленные
questions
вопрошания этого периода.
is
И
extremely relevant for him in that
это
period.
искусство действительно любит ставить вопросы, но в отличие от западного концептуализма совершенно не любит на них
Unlike
отвечать.
the Western
И в этом,
conceptual art,
в
Moscow
частности,
artists
особый
don't like
характер московской
answering the
концептуальной
questions.
школы, в
They like
традицию
just
которого
raising them.
Пивоварова вписали уже прочно и навсегда. И несмотря на то, что у него у самого есть сомнения касательно принадлежности к этому кругу,
Despite
но
the
так
fact
или
that Viktor
иначе он
Pivovarov still doubts about where he belongs, is that the
и
conceptual
по судьбе, и по
art or
биографии, и
not,
по
but
разным
his
приемам и преемственностям
biography,
к этой
the
школе
devices, the
принадлежит.
tools
Ам,
he
И
uses makes researchers
внутри
attribute him
внутри
to
этой
this
уже
circle, to
сложившейся
this group.
традиции действительно
And
ам,
inside
вопрос
tradition,
стоит дороже ответа.
indeed,
И, конечно же,
questions
для этой,
matter more than
для этой
answers.
школы существует несколько таких ключевых тем,
There are a few key topics
существенных для
that are
старшего,
raised, that are
среднего и
repeated
младшего поколения.
in
Это
that school that are
тема
relevant for all the generations.
маленького человека, продолжающая
Namely,
колоссальную
the narrative of a small person
тему классического периода русской литературы XIX
which
века.
builds on the classical
И
Russian
эта
literature of the
тема
19th century. But not only that.
экзистенциального одиночества.
Another narrative is existential loneliness of the contemporary human being thrown into the contemporary world of despair and loneliness. But Pivovarov has his own solutions for this.
Не только человек, в данном случае это самостоятельная работа, живописная «Черное яблоко», как его обычно называют.
This is one of his iconic paintings, normally called The Black Apple. It all started as an album, Microhomus, which Pivovarov painted in 1979. Here, he works with the narrative of a small person, not the one that feels pressure from the system, not the despaired one, but just literally a small person. Because of a scientific experiment, this person became tiny, and you can see him sitting On the book cover, you can see that he can't reach the table, and finally, when he reaches the desk, he jumps into a matchbox and disappears into the unknown. Later on, at the exhibition that Pivovarov made at the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, the show was titled A Snail Trace. For that show, he made an installation with different scenes of microhomers interacting with his colleague in the bigger world, in the earthly world. Both in his graphics and audio installation, we can see precisely this metaphorical and very complex world, where there is no right and no wrong, where there are no clear boundaries between the good and the evil. Everybody seems to be kind and worthy of paradise, and sometimes what most importantly happens in their life is a kind of a fatal action. Sometimes it is a catastrophe. Pivovarov tries to come up with a protection that can shield him off the world of bosses, of crowds in the metro, and queues, eternal lines in the shops. He comes up with these devices for those that hate standing in the queue, for those that hate their bureaucratic work. If a person gets a sacralizator, that's the name of the series, they can protect themselves from different aggressive environments. And if the previous character definitely belongs to the middle generation of the Soviet society, here we can see a teenager or a student who is forced to listen to talks. In 1981, Pivovarov's life changes. Back in the 70s, he met Milena Slavitskaya. Back then, she was secretary of Indrich Cholupetsky, a name that you have already heard. She came to Moscow to help him collect art about the Moscow art scene. He attended different workshops together with him. And of course, half of Moscow were in love with this beauty. Pivovarov fell in love too, and in 1981, they married. In 1982, Pivovarov left for the Czech Republic, and he was based in Prague. Since then, he does not only think of himself as a Soviet, Russian, and Moscow artist, but he feels at home in the Czech Republic, unlike other artists who, as we know from Milena Slavitskaya memoirs, were a bit hostile towards the art of a neighboring Eastern European country. However, neither Bulatov nor Kabakov were interested in the Czech art. But Pivovarov is very open, and he maintained this kind of childish curiosity, so he was an exception to the rule. Unlike other migrants, when Pivovarov went to a different country, for him, it did not become a crisis. On the contrary, It was the period where he grasped a lot of opportunities, the opportunities that Pivovarov could not think of in Moscow with its cold academic approach and with its demands to the underground artists. I will just quote a few examples. During the perestroika period, Georgian abstraction painters came to Moscow with a show. The show was open officially near the Belyaevo metro. One of the art historians, looking at these paintings, she said, "I cannot discuss it. This is too beautiful." It was difficult to be too beautiful in Moscow. It was not comme il faut. But in the Czech Republic, Viktor Pivovarov allows himself to be beautiful, expressive, bright. His manner of painting changes, becomes more colorful. He makes a series of still lifes, and it seems that he is enjoying the opportunity to work with bright colors, textured surfaces. He retains some of the narratives that were already visible in his surrealist works and conceptual works. After a while, however, he returns to his Moscow style. As he says in one of his interviews about this return, he says, the first thing he returned to was text, interaction between text and images. Viktor Pivovarov even wrote a book about it, published by the New Literary Observer many years ago, a book on the interaction between images and words. Like Bulatov, Kabakov, and many other representatives of this school, Pivovarov wanted to highlight the relationship between the pictorial and the textual layers of a painting. Each of them could open a new space. In this case, we see that in the text he enumerates the objects seen in the painting. Sorry, this is a different slide. This is part of the period of him assimilating in the Czech Republic when he works with textures and with bright colors. In the previous painting, you saw a list that accompanies an image. This is a different work from the 1988 series, The Time of the Rose. It is a bit more complex because here Pivovarov makes his narratives more conceptual. He does not just include real objects into the structure, but also uses puns. At the same time, many images in retrospect coincide with the images that seem to have stayed in the past in Pivovarov's work. That includes the rabbit hole where one can hide. And I want to draw your attention to a very strict design. I can't even call it pictoriality or painting. It's that, it's design. These are arranged rectangular spaces with subdued colors and with inscriptions that refer to the images already present in the frame. This is also how his famous series, Apartment 22, is organized. It is dedicated to the life in a communal apartment where Viktor Pivovarov spent his childhood. Here you can see his angry neighbor, his good neighbor, his tired mother, and the relatives that came for lunch. But the whole world of this apartment looks like a scheme. We can see contours, we can see spaces filled with monochrome colors, and inscriptions separated from the image itself. Pivovarov's art stands out because many thought him to be more traditional than radical conceptual artists, but I think it's an omission. There's art historians that think so. I think just miss the inner mythology of the Pivovarov's world. We can see the same eidos or the same entities emerging every time they acquire a new meaning. For example, by the way, his painting goes back to expression, to bright colors. This is how the image of a fox appears. The image of a fox appears in his compositions many times, and it's the image of canny sexuality that can find its way into Malevich's Black Square and into the identity of Malevich even. And of course, in the imagination of Pivovarov, this fox keeps traveling from one painting to another. It is part of those motifs that can come together into alternative narratives. One of those images is the faceless person, a person without face, a fox, the Russian avant-garde in contemporary art. All of these images are examples of those narratives. Another one is distorted in a dreamlike manner space that we can see in early 70s works and in the series Teenage Diary and in a later work of 2002, which reminds one of another very famous work titled A Long, Long Hand. This surreal overlaps with the world feature breakthroughs into different realms. Here we can see again a formally dressed man, a chair. So it's the same world. It's the same world where the author reigns with his amazing talent, not for intellectual tricks, but for heartfelt lyricism. This is what I would call it. Although in later works, of course, we can see a more detached and cold perspective on reality. However, for Pivovarov, painting is a tradition that he continues. And it's no accident that sometimes he makes references to the great masters of the past. When he returns from the more graphic works like Room 22, he comes to classical still lifes in the manner of Dutch painters of the 18th century. This is a series dated 2004. I think this is an indication to the fact that nobody can cancel art history. No new theory can kill the pleasure that is granted by classical art, despite modernism and postmodernism. Another work right here is titled Lemon Eaters. This is a huge cycle shown in Moscow in 2006. This lemon and the bitter truth is always present in the art of Pivovarov. At the same time, it is a symbol. It is a symbol of Old Testament. It's the citron, it's the apple that allows the adult magician to see the world through the eyes of a child. This is exactly what he does in his series titled The Fifth Law. This is all for me. Today's talk was a bit shorter than the previous ones. Do you have any questions about what you have just heard? The Moscow Conceptual Circle looks like a secret society, and many of later artists keep talking about the symbolism used by this community, comparing it with the Masons. Was it their idea to somehow mask, to hide the symbols that show their belonging to the secret circle? Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure what you're referring to here, but there were no such symbols. There are no images, and I wouldn't say that there was a coat of arms or an emblem of the Moscow Conceptual Art. There were some motifs that are reproduced, they repeated themselves, which is perfectly natural when just a few dozen agents share their everyday life, discuss their divorces, marriages, and keep communicating with each other all the time. Because if you don't do that, you can just disappear in this gray and dull environment. These artists really loved communication. It was something that was very dear to them. And although the circle expanded, its core remained the same. Even new participants merged with the circle, so it was a real community. This community that used to hide in the ivory tower or in the irony tower, as Andrew Solomon used to say, in the Soviet Sea could look like exactly that, like a secret society. They could look like that to the outsider, but of course they didn't mean that. In 1985-86, post factum, Andrei Monastyrsky and Vladimir Sorokin came up with a literary project, Ira Monk Sergei. Hiram priest monk Sergei, Hiram monk. This is where there was a certain indication of hierarchy. It was titled The Hierarchy of the Hierom Monk Sergei, the translation of money, Moscow Archive of Hebrew Art. And there, of course, it was literally mystification, but they played with it a lot. They came up with different nicknames, and this is a great piece of art. Thank you very much for your talk. Pivovarov's art has a lot of different symbols, lemons, foxes, and others. I was curious about the meaning, the symbolism of these images. Did Viktor Pivovarov speak about that, or do we take this just as cultural symbols? Why do you think that these symbols mean what they do? A symbol would not be called a symbol unless it has symbolic meaning. The artist himself used to talk about the images he chose, including the fox, for example. He talked about the very long, outstretched arm that he reproduced in many works. But on the other hand, as I think you understand, artists are not always accountable for their subconscious, for what they show subconsciously in their works. In the first talk, we discussed Edward Steinberg and his art, and the text by Evgeny Shifers on his works. And you may remember that Evgeny Shifers saw in Steinberg's art hints at the symbolic language. So it was a kind of a gift. It's something that Steinberg himself never saw in his works. So I think although Viktor is very attentive to his work, he was not abandoning him in the subconscious. However, for example, I don't remember him writing about the lemon as the citron, as a kind of a biblical image, but this is so obvious in his works that belong to different periods. So here I take the liberty to guess that it's a symbol and not just a lemon, not just a fruit, not just a citrus. But the fruit of paradise. Thank you very much. And if it's okay, I would like to ask another question. At the very beginning, when we discussed Ole Lukoya, we said that there Pivovarov turned to Bosk. It was not quite clear for me what he borrowed from Bosk. The details, the depth, the combination of the things that normally don't come together, adding a lot of images, but not ugliness, of course, not distorted figures, rather this kind of fantastic diversity of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Да. Да, я понимаю, да. Пивоваров, ну, наверное, самая знаменитая работа
I
Пивоварова
think
в
the
итальянской литературе — это заставка журнала «Веселые
most
картинки».
famous work by Pivovarov is the cover of Веселые картинки, the funny pictures. Do you remember those dancing children that come together into lettering? Of course, he illustrated books, but also journals, magazines, newspapers. So this world of illustrators was also a very close community. Solster, Yankelevsky, Mikhail Brodman all worked in the Znание Sila, Knowledge is Power publishing house. And they saw each other, they saw each other's works. But most importantly, and Kabakov's and Pivovarov's biographies show that very clearly, when you make a discovery when illustrating a book for children, you can feel much freer. Some of these works were published in millions of copies. In books for children, one can completely subvert the ideas, one can play with the composition, one can play with the images. So artists could repeat each other. As for the depression of 79, I mean social depression, it's a stretch. I'm currently reading letters of the artists to their friends that migrated for the States, Victor and Margarita Tupitsins. And the letters are not that depressing, frankly. They're quite full of excitement. They tell about the exhibitions that were opened back then, color, form, and space with Kabakov's work. There were campaigns of collective actions being held, which were attended like vernissages in contemporary world. The Opt-Art gallery concept emerged back then, so the scene was pretty much alive. It was vibrant. They didn't need that. I mean, those artists that I'm talking about, they didn't care, unlike the artists of the 60s. They lived in their own reality, which was parallel to the official one. They didn't look for audiences. They did not need any communication with the external world. I gave some examples the next time with Kabakov's works, which could not be evacuated through the door, and they had to be passed down through the window. So these artists belonged to the group, to the community, and it was very dear to them. Beyond that was a kind of a sea and ocean, as Kabakov described in one of his conversations with Joseph Backstein, if I'm not mistaken. That was the situation was similar to Livingstone being in Africa. Like, he came to Africa, he does not understand anything, there are people around, and he starts studying and researching the people around him. And he used these tactics when he left for the Czech Republic. So I wouldn't say that it took its toll on them. Those who wanted to leave the USSR did that, or almost all of them. Yes, absolutely. And once again, I want to draw your attention that Kebakov was considering migration like Yankelevsky, but they decided against that. They said no. And Pivovarov, if he didn't leave for Prague when he married, he would never have left Moscow. So they were just closed, they shut off the external world. Microhomus. Well, one could say that, yes. But for Pivovarov, it was no accident that in 2016 he reproduced this image, where, by the way, I was the voice of the character of the external reality of the outside world. Still, for him, it was important that there is a different dimension and a person can be different, can become a giant or can get smaller or can fall into a different dimension or into a matchbox, anything. The Pivovarov's world is very flexible, and this microhumus appears in different works, not only against the culmination of Brezhnev's Zastoy, but also in our contemporaneity.
Да. Ну, вы знаете, я бы вам сказала так.
Well, here is how I would answer your
Между
question.
героикой Нет, я вам хочу обратить ваше внимание на то, что
Yeah.
была героика
I want to draw attention to the heroes of Stalin's triumphant social realism, and decades later, the rough style started. The subdued style started, but in between there is, for example, Reshetnikov's art, where the character was very much subjective. However, Stalin's art turned everybody, all the characters, into heroes. There was no privacy. That's true for late 40s and beginning of the 50s. There was no subjectivity at all. And eventually, the same Kabakov always referred to Akaky Akakievich, the small person in Gogol's writings. And the Russian literature, and in the Soviet reality, the same small person emerged in the communal apartment. For Kabakov, this connection was apparent. Good evening. Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question about illustrations, about the originals of Eric Bulatov. What is their destiny? Where are they kept? And can one see them? I don't even know what to say. I have never wondered, frankly. He did not keep anything, so I'm not sure. Where is it? Sorry, no answer. At least a few years ago, we turned to him asking him whether he had an archive which he could share. He said, "No, I don't keep things." Okay then. If there are no more questions, I suggest that we call it a day. Thank you very much. See you again soon. We're going to talk about two other great artists. I think Francisco Infante and Vyacheslav Kolychuk are scheduled for the next week. Thank you very much for coming.